like different patterns for major, sort of.
Hi. Okay. I wish I didn't have that much wine, but that's cool. It's really surreal being in conversation with you because I've been reading your work since I was a fashion blogger, and when I was reading this book, it was almost traumatizing how meta it felt, because when you were talking about Susie and Brian, I was recalling being in conversation with them at shows, and we never talked about race, not once. And I do remember when you have several moments in this book when you bring up a couple posts from Susie about her race. And I remember particularly that Chanel, I think, review that she did when she was like, other Asian women, she was distancing herself from race. And I noticed that about Ami, or like Song of Style. All of these bloggers, I think myself included, because I'm incredibly white passing, is that there's always a distance, and you both talk about in your books about cultural difference and in the very complex connections between, generating things, whether you're a designer working with like Asian women in your community, or if you're a blogger that's recognizing your cultural history in a garment but never wanting to wear it because you don't want to, as I think Susie said in her post, like you don't want to wear your race on your sleeve. And can you just explain more of what you mean about cultural difference, like both of you, in your context to the people that might not have read your book yet? Cool.
The not wearing your race on your sleeve. So there's a few moments where, as happens in fashion, Asian chic comes back around again, right? It never really leaves, but every once in a while there's a season in which everyone is doing Asian chic, and there's a couple of blog posts where Susie Bubble talks about how much she appreciates whatever designer, whatever collection, but says over and over again that she can't actually wear these. And she says that she understands that on her body, right, wearing these Asian chic fashions makes her look like a waitress, and she says in a dodgy Chinese restaurant, right? So she recognizes that her body and the ways in which her racial difference in a industry and a culture that is still blindingly white, right? She understands her difference. When she says she doesn't want to wear her race on her sleeve, this is a really interesting moment for me, because in fact I argue that these bloggers all wear their race on their sleeve, which is to say that they use style, they use fashion in order to change, to rearticulate what is a group identity, Asianness, for example, right, into a personal style, into an aesthetic, into a fashion statement. And so that when Susie Bubble talks about all those other Chinese women who can wear cheongsams, right, but she can't, even though she's distancing herself from all those other Asian women, all those other Chinese women who wears it. But she's also saying that unlike those other Asian women who might be critical of Asian chic, she sees the artistry. It's a thing that you can put on. I mean, this is the whole thing about Asian chic, right? That you can put on a kind of try on difference, try on racial difference without actually having to commit to being that body, right? So cultural difference is this really complex thing, I think, in both of our books, where we're talking about how to negotiate this difference in ways that are still legible, right? Especially in the fashion industry, which is about particular kinds of visibility that have to be legible.
Yeah, and in my book, I was writing about Asian fashion designers at the moment where they're sort of emerging, right? So, before we really knew who Alexander Wang and all these, right, Prabal and all these people were. And, these people are starting out, and then the newspaper is noticing, oh my God, there's a bunch of Asian designers. What Asian-y thing are you going to do, right? And this drives them nuts, understandably, and they don't want to identify in this kind of narrowly ethnic category, and they don't want to be identified in these narrowly prescripted aesthetic categories either. But they know each other, right? They've worked for each other. A lot of them interned with each other's companies before becoming, right, their own company, right? So the idea about Asianness there is a much more networked idea, right? That's sort of somewhere underneath the clothes, right? And on the aesthetic level, when I first started interviewing these designers, they would say to me things like, I ask them how they get into fashion. They tell me about being a child of a garment worker or a tailor. But they also say things like, I'm really good at math, so I'm really good at doing this. And that does not compute to me, because what does that have to do with designing, right? And actually, as I sort of unravel this story, right, what they're actually telling me constitutes an Asian aesthetic in their mind is an approach to clothing, right? That's about a rethinking of the relationship between cloth and body, right? That draws from different traditions, right? It's not about some like remade cheongsam, right? It's not about like a little frog clip, right? It's about thinking about, for example, how the kimono, right, rests on the body so differently, right, than other forms of draping, right, that we see in a kind of Euro-American tradition, right? So the long and short, or the long and long, I guess, of this is that cultural difference matters. It just doesn't matter in the way that we think it does, right?
Yeah, that's actually a really good lead into my next, I guess, discussion point about the idea of like being post-racial and being incredibly present and marketing yourself as just a blogger and never mentioning race. There was this one line in your book that you mention about Brian Boy imagining his racial identity to be transcendent. And I just want to ask you more about that, because one of the things that I think you both talk about is, how do I put this? Maintaining connections to your family and with your racial identity, but not letting that define you necessarily. And I think that you particularly talk about the differences between Japanese designers and Asian American designers. And like Alexander Wang, I didn't even know that he was Taiwanese American until I read the book, because I was just like, he's just like an American designer, and that felt strange. And I'm just wondering how we navigate Asianness in personal style without feeling like you're being campy, right. Or how do we navigate being authentic? Mm-hmm. I don't know. Any thoughts?
Well, it's hard to use the word authentic with Brian Boy. Whoops. Brian Boy in a lot of ways. He is intentionally inauthentic, right? He's intentionally over the top. Yeah, and early on, not so much anymore, but early on he used to, and I'm going to forget now, he was a self-described global superstar when he was still living in his parents' house, right? Like it was a really important kind of political statement for him in some ways, though I don't think that he saw it so much as a political statement. But this idea, and he mentions over and over again, that the fashion world forgets about the Philippines, forgets about Manila. There are collections that he sees online that he'll never be able to buy. They're never ever available in any store in Manila. And he's actually called out the fashion industry for treating Manila as if it doesn't exist, right? Treating the Philippines. So in that way, there's a kind of a tragicness about him. On the other hand, the way in which he kind of self-inflates, and he's got this kind of over-the-top, not just over-the-top look, but also an over-the-top kind of idea about who he is, I think is actually really powerful, because he is not only Asian in a white industry and culture, but also he's from the third world, and it's something that he continues to talk about, right? So what is it to be authentically third world for the fashion world, the Western fashion world. That's a tough line to toe, right? On the one hand, there are so many stereotypes about who the third world Asian person is. And they don't see them as, they may be fashion makers, like actually making the clothes, but they don't see them as trendsetters, as people who make fashion matter in the kind of symbolic world. And so authenticity, I think, is, again, it's one of those things that is situational. I think he is being authentic in the sense that the performance is genuinely meant to provoke, and I do talk about his kind of camping fashion by calling it out. But in calling out fashion and camping fashion, he offers, for example, he offers sexual favors, right, to different designers if they will let him have clothes, right? These kinds of moments are ways in which I think he's tongue-in-cheek talking about, pointing out the kinds of exploitative relationships that the West has had specifically with the third world, right, with Asia. And so that kind of authenticity, or that kind of performance, or what I call taste work, is a way of producing a counter vision of what we think we know Asians are, right, and what we think their tastes are, what we think their role in fashion is, as just the people that make our clothes for $1 a day, right?
Yeah, I'm trying to ponder this broader question about kind of the post-racial, right? And the term is a hard one to chew on, in light of all of the stuff that's been happening around Black lives, right, in this historical moment. At the same time, to pick up on what Minh-Ha was saying, the kind of normative idea of what is the ideal, right, in this historical moment can't be the same as in, say, the last century, right? That the ideas about what is the ideal body, or who is the ideal subject, or who is the proper or ideal subject of fashion, right? It can't be the same, and it isn't, right? And the reason it isn't the same is because the world is not the same, right? This is not internal to the fashion industry and what it does or wants or imagines or who it wants to include or exclude, right? It's a part of a larger social and political world in which there is a shift in geopolitics, right? Where Asia's kind of, right, increase in military, economic, and other forms of power, right, is hard to dispute, right? And that doesn't mean we live in a post-racial world, or that Asianness doesn't matter, and Asianness is not tied to some idea of hierarchy, right? But there are sort of shifting ideals, right? Because we live in a world that is shifting.
That actually reminds me particularly of the fact that, like, at the